In the autumn of 1944, as the leaves turned gold and red in the forests of eastern France, the world was watching the slow, grinding progress of the Allied armies as they pushed toward Germany. The war in Europe was far from over. The German army, though battered and retreating, was still a formidable force, and the terrain of the Vosges Mountains provided a natural fortress for the defenders. It was here, in these dense, mist-shrouded woods, that one of the most dramatic and harrowing episodes of World War II would unfold, a story of courage, endurance, and brotherhood that would become legend. This is the story of the Lost Battalion. The 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 36th Texas Division, was made up of men from all walks of life. They were farmers and factory workers, teachers and students, sons of immigrants and sons of Texas. Many had already fought their way through Italy and southern France, and now, as the cold rains of October set in, they were ordered to advance through the Vosges Mountains. Their mission was to break through the German lines, liberate the town of Bifontaine, and open the way to the Rhine. The men were tired, but their spirits were high. They believed the end of the war was in sight. The advance began on October 24, 1944. The battalion moved out at dawn, pushing through thick underbrush and muddy trails. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of boots and the distant rumble of artillery. The men were on edge, knowing the enemy could be anywhere. The Germans had turned the Vosges into a fortress, with machine gun nests hidden in the trees, mines buried along the trails, and snipers waiting for any careless movement. Every step forward was a risk. At first, the advance was steady. The battalion made good progress, capturing a series of small hills and clearing out pockets of resistance. But as they moved deeper into the forest, the resistance stiffened. German artillery began to rain down, mortars exploded in the treetops, and the men found themselves under constant fire. The weather turned against them, with cold rain turning the ground to mud and making every movement a struggle. Still, the men pressed on, determined to complete their mission. By the evening of October 24th, the battalion had advanced several miles, but they were dangerously exposed. Unknown to them, German forces were massing on their flanks, preparing to spring a trap. The battalion's commanders, relying on outdated maps and incomplete intelligence, believed the enemy was in retreat. In reality, the Germans were preparing a counterattack that would cut the battalion off from the rest of the division. The trap closed on the morning of October 25th. As the battalion pushed forward, German troops struck from both sides, severing the narrow trail that was their only link to the rear. Communications were lost. The battalion was surrounded, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. The men quickly realized the gravity of their situation. They were deep in enemy territory, with no way to retreat and no hope of immediate rescue. The first hours of the siege were chaotic. German mortars and machine guns raked the battalion's positions, forcing the men to dig in wherever they could. Foxholes were hastily scraped out of the muddy ground, and the wounded were carried to makeshift aid stations under the trees. The battalion's radio operators worked frantically to re-establish contact with headquarters, but the dense forest and enemy jamming made communication nearly impossible. The men rationed their food and water, knowing it might be days before help could arrive. As the day wore on, the reality of their predicament set in. The battalion was low on ammunition, and medical supplies were running out. The wounded lay in the cold, tended by medics who did their best with what little they had. Every attempt to break out was met with withering fire. The Germans demanded surrender, but the men refused. They were determined to hold out, no matter the cost. Night fell over the forest, bringing a cold, damp darkness that seeped into every bone. The men huddled in their foxholes, listening to the sounds of the enemy moving in the trees. Some wrote letters home, unsure if they would ever be sent. Others whispered prayers or made quiet promises to their friends. If one of us makes it out, tell my family I fought to the end. In the darkness, the bonds of brotherhood grew stronger. The men knew they could only survive if they stood together. The next morning brought more attacks. The Germans probed the battalion's lines, looking for weaknesses. Snipers picked off anyone who moved. Mortar shells exploded in the treetops, sending deadly splinters raining down. The men learned to keep their heads down, to move only when absolutely necessary. Every hour was a test of nerves and endurance. Despite the terror, acts of heroism were everywhere. Soldiers risked their lives to bring water to the wounded, to repair broken radios, to keep hope alive. The battalion's officers moved among the men, offering words of encouragement and sharing what little food they had. In the face of overwhelming odds, the men of the Lost Battalion refused to give up. As the siege dragged on, the situation grew more desperate. Food and water were almost gone. Ammunition was running low. The wounded suffered in silence, their only hope the promise of rescue. But the men held on, drawing strength from each other and from the belief that they would not be forgotten. As the days passed, the ordeal of the Lost Battalion deepened. The forest that had once seemed merely foreboding now felt like a prison. The men's uniforms were soaked through, their boots caked with mud, and their faces hollowed by exhaustion and hunger. Each morning brought the same grim routine, scanning the mist for signs of the enemy, tending to the wounded, and rationing the last crumbs of food and drops of water. The battalion's medics, working with dwindling supplies, improvised splints from branches and used torn shirts as bandages. The wounded, some with grave injuries, endured the pain in silence, refusing to show weakness in front of their comrades. The Germans, aware of the battalion's isolation, tightened the noose. They set up machine gun nests along every possible escape route and mined the trails leading out of the encirclement. At night, German patrols crept close to the American lines, sometimes hurling grenades or shouting taunts in broken English. The psychological pressure was immense. The men of the Lost Battalion knew that capture could mean death or imprisonment, and that surrender was not an option they were willing to consider. Back at division headquarters, the disappearance of the 1st Battalion sent shockwaves through the command structure. Radio contact had been lost, and initial attempts to reach the battalion by patrol had failed. The division commander, Major General John Dahlquist, refused to accept that his men were lost. He ordered immediate efforts to locate and rescue the battalion, dispatching reconnaissance teams and calling for air support. The news spread quickly through the ranks. The 1st Battalion was surrounded, and every available resource would be used to bring them home. The first attempts at resupply came from the air. Pilots braved enemy fire to drop canisters of food, water, and ammunition into the forest. Some of the supplies landed within the battalion's perimeter, but many fell into German hands or were lost in the dense undergrowth. The men scrambled to retrieve what they could, risking sniper fire and mortar shells for a few precious rations. Each successful drop was a lifeline, a reminder that they had not been forgotten. Inside the perimeter, discipline and morale were maintained by the battalion's leaders. Officers and non-commissioned officers moved among the men, sharing news from headquarters and encouraging them to hold on. They organized watches, rotated men through the most exposed positions, and made sure that every soldier had a task. In the face of adversity, the battalion's cohesion held firm. The men drew strength from each other, from their shared hardships, and from the knowledge that their stand was being watched by the entire division. The Germans, frustrated by the battalion's stubborn resistance, increased the intensity of their attacks. Artillery barrages pounded the American positions, and infantry assaults probed the lines day and night. The defenders responded with everything they had: rifles, machine guns, grenades, and even bayonets when the fighting grew close. The forest echoed with the sounds of battle, the crack of gunfire, the thud of mortars, the shouts of men fighting for their lives. Amid the chaos, stories of individual bravery emerged. One squad leader, seeing a wounded comrade exposed to enemy fire, crawled through the mud to drag him to safety, ignoring the bullets that snapped overhead. A radio operator, working with a damaged set, managed to get a message through to headquarters, giving the battalion's position and requesting urgent help. Medics risked their lives to reach the wounded, crawling from foxhole to foxhole under fire. These acts of courage, repeated countless times, became the glue that held the battalion together. As the siege wore on, the men's thoughts turned to home. Letters, written in the brief lulls between attacks, were tucked into pockets or hidden in helmets, in the hope that they might one day be delivered. Some men made quiet promises to God, vowing to live better lives if they survived. Others found solace in the camaraderie of their fellow soldiers, sharing stories, jokes, and memories to keep their spirits alive. The battalion's predicament was not unique in the annals of war, but the scale of their isolation and the ferocity of the enemy's attacks made their situation especially dire. The men knew that their only hope lay in rescue from the outside. Every distant rumble of artillery, every burst of gunfire from beyond the perimeter was analyzed for signs that help was on the way. Meanwhile, the division commander was preparing a bold plan. He called upon the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, to break through the German lines and reach the trapped battalion. The 442nd had already earned a reputation for bravery and determination, but the mission they were about to undertake would test them as never before. The men of the 442nd understood the stakes. They knew that the lives of their fellow soldiers depended on their success. They also knew that, as Japanese Americans, they were fighting not just for victory in Europe, but for respect and acceptance at home. The order was given: break through the German lines, reach the Lost Battalion, and bring them home. As the 442nd prepared for their assault, the men of the Lost Battalion continued to hold out. Each day was a test of endurance, each night a battle against fear and despair. But the promise of rescue, the knowledge that their comrades were coming for them, gave them the strength to carry on. The morning of October 27, 1944, dawned cold and gray over the Vosges Mountains. In the battered perimeter of the Lost Battalion, hope flickered with every distant sound of gunfire. The men strained to hear any sign that help was coming. For the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the day began with a sense of grim determination. They knew the task before them was nearly impossible: break through heavily fortified German lines, traverse steep forested ridges under constant fire, and reach the trapped battalion before it was too late. The 432nd's assault began with a barrage of artillery, intended to soften the German defenses. The men moved out in small groups, advancing from tree to tree, using every bit of cover the forest could provide. The Germans, well dug in and familiar with the terrain, responded with machine gun fire, mortars, and snipers. The fighting was brutal and close. The forest echoed with the sounds of battle: shouts, explosions, the crack of rifles, and the cries of the wounded. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Every hill and ravine had to be taken by force. The 442nd soldiers crawled through mud, braved booby traps, and charged enemy positions with bayonets and grenades. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly, determined to hold their ground and prevent the rescue. The casualties mounted. Medics worked tirelessly, dragging the wounded to safety, patching up injuries, and offering words of encouragement to men who were barely able to stand. Despite the carnage, the 442nd pressed on. Their motivation was more than just orders. It was a sense of duty, of brotherhood, and of proving themselves in a world that had doubted their loyalty. Many of these men had families in internment camps back in the United States. Fighting for their country and for the lives of their fellow soldiers was both a burden and a source of pride. Inside the Lost Battalion's perimeter, the sounds of battle grew louder. The men listened as the fighting drew closer, daring to hope that rescue was at hand. They watched the tree line for any sign of friendly troops, knowing that the difference between life and death could be a matter of minutes. The battalion's officers kept the men focused, reminding them to conserve ammunition and stay alert. Every man knew that the final moments of the siege would be the most dangerous. The 442nd's advance was relentless. They attacked German bunkers with grenades, cleared machine gun nests with close-quarters combat, and refused to be stopped by the enemy's fierce resistance. The cost was staggering. In just a few days, the 442nd suffered over 800 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. But their determination never wavered. They were fighting for their brothers, for their honor, and for the promise that no man would be left behind. On October 30th, after days of savage fighting, the 442nd broke through the final German defenses. The battered survivors of the Lost Battalion emerged from their foxholes, gaunt and exhausted, but alive. The rescuers and the rescued embraced, some weeping openly, others too stunned to speak. The relief was overwhelming. Against all odds, the mission had succeeded. The forest, once a place of terror and isolation, became a scene of reunion and gratitude. Medics tended to the wounded, sharing what little supplies they had. The men of the Lost Battalion, many of whom had not eaten a full meal in days, were given food and water. Letters that had been written in the darkness were finally sent home, bearing witness to the ordeal and the rescue. The cost of the rescue was immense. The 442nd's ranks were decimated, and the Lost Battalion had lost many of its own. But the bond forged in those desperate days would never be broken. The men who survived would carry the memory of the siege for the rest of their lives, honoring the sacrifice of those who did not return. News of the rescue spread quickly through the Allied lines. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was hailed as heroes, their bravery and sacrifice recognized by commanders and comrades alike. The story of the Lost Battalion became a symbol of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of soldiers who refused to give up. For the men of the 442nd, the victory was bittersweet. They had accomplished their mission, but at a terrible cost. Many of their friends and comrades had fallen in the effort to save others. The survivors struggled with the weight of loss, even as they took pride in what they had achieved. Their actions would become legend, a testament to the power of brotherhood and the willingness to risk everything for a cause greater than oneself. As the rescued and rescuers made their way back to Allied lines, they were greeted with cheers, handshakes, and tears. The ordeal was over, but the impact of those days in the forest would linger. The Lost Battalion had been found, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. In the next section, we will explore the aftermath of the rescue, the recognition and legacy of the 442nd and the Lost Battalion, and the personal stories of the men who lived through one of WWII's most daring and costly missions. The days following the rescue of the Lost Battalion were filled with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and sorrow. For the men who had survived the siege, every breath of fresh air outside the forest felt like a gift. They were finally safe, but the ordeal had left its mark. Many were gaunt from hunger, their uniforms in tatters, their faces lined with fatigue and the memory of what they had endured. The medics and doctors worked tirelessly to treat wounds, both visible and hidden, as the men tried to process the trauma of being surrounded, cut off, and nearly lost to history. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, whose heroism had made the rescue possible, was also reeling from the cost. The unit had suffered devastating casualties, over 800 men killed, wounded, or missing in just 5 days of fighting. The survivors of the 442nd were hailed as heroes by their commanders and fellow soldiers, but the price of their bravery was written in the empty bunks and the silence of those who did not return. For many, the victory was bittersweet. They had fulfilled their mission, but at a terrible cost. Recognition for the 442nd sacrifice came quickly. General Dahlquist, the division commander, personally thanked the men, though his words could not erase the pain of their losses. The 442nd would go on to become the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history, earning thousands of medals, including more than 20 medals of honor. Their actions in the Vosges Mountains became a symbol of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable spirit of soldiers who fought for a country that had not always fought for them. For the men of the Lost Battalion, the rescue was both an end and a beginning. They were welcomed back as heroes, their story spreading quickly through the Allied lines and back home to the United States. Newspapers carried headlines about the daring rescue, and families who had feared the worst wept with relief. The men were given time to rest and recover, but the memories of the siege would stay with them forever. Some struggled with survivors' guilt, haunted by the friends they had lost. Others found strength in the bond they shared, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of battle. Personal stories from the survivors reveal the depth of their ordeal. Some spoke of the terror of waiting in silence as German patrols crept through the trees, of the hunger that gnawed at their bellies, and the thirst that made every drop of water precious. Others remembered the small acts of kindness that kept hope alive. A shared cigarette, a whispered joke, a promise to look after a friend's family if the worst should happen. Letters written during the siege, many of which were finally sent after the rescue, spoke of love, fear, and the determination to survive. The legacy of the Lost Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team would grow in the years after the war. Their story became a lesson in courage and sacrifice, taught in schools and honored at reunions and memorials. The men of the 442nd, many of whom had families in internment camps back in the United States, proved their loyalty beyond any doubt. Their actions helped change attitudes and policies, paving the way for greater acceptance and recognition of Japanese Americans in the decades that followed. For the survivors, the years after the war were a time of reflection and remembrance. Many returned to civilian life, building families and careers, but the bond they shared with their fellow soldiers remained unbreakable. Reunions were held, stories were told, and the memory of those who did not return was kept alive. Some men struggled with the invisible wounds of war, carrying the weight of their experiences in silence. Others found solace in speaking about what they had endured, hoping that their story would inspire future generations to value courage, loyalty, and the power of brotherhood. The story of the Lost Battalion and the 442nd is not just a tale of battle and rescue. It is a story of what it means to stand by your comrades, to refuse to give up, and to find hope in the darkest of times. It is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit can endure and triumph. The men who lived through those days in the Vosges Mountains became more than soldiers. They became symbols of resilience and the enduring power of hope. As the years passed, the survivors of the Lost Battalion and the 442nd continued to honor their fallen brothers. Memorials were built in France and the United States, bearing the names of those who gave their lives. Ceremonies were held, medals awarded, and stories shared with new generations. The legacy of their courage lives on, not just in the history books, but in the hearts of all who hear their story. In the next and final section, we will reflect on the enduring impact of the Lost Battalion's ordeal, the lessons it holds for our own time, and the remarkable truth that even in the darkest moments, acts of courage and brotherhood can change the course of history. The story of the Lost Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team did not end with the last shots fired in the Vosges Mountains. Instead, their ordeal and their rescue became a living legacy, a testament to the power of courage, sacrifice, and unity in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the survivors returned home, their experiences shaped not only their own lives, but also the nation's understanding of heroism, loyalty, and the true meaning of brotherhood. For many of the men, the transition back to civilian life was both a relief and a challenge. The memories of the siege, the faces of lost friends, and the sounds of battle lingered long after the war was over. Some struggled with nightmares and the invisible wounds of trauma, while others found strength in the bonds they had forged in the forest. Reunions became a cherished tradition, a time to remember, to honor the fallen, and to share the stories that only those who had been there could truly understand. The impact of the Lost Battalion's ordeal rippled far beyond the men themselves. Their rescue by the 442nd Regimental Combat Team became a symbol of what could be achieved when people stood together, regardless of background or circumstance. The 442nd's heroism helped to break down barriers of prejudice and discrimination, especially against Japanese Americans who had faced suspicion and internment at home, even as they fought and died for their country abroad. Their valor forced the nation to confront its own contradictions and inspired changes in policy and public perception in the years that followed. The story was told and retold in newspapers, books, documentaries, and classrooms. It became a lesson in resilience, a reminder that the darkest moments can bring out the best in people. The Lost Battalion's refusal to surrender, their determination to hold out against all odds, and the 442nd's relentless drive to reach them became a blueprint for courage under fire. Their example has inspired generations of soldiers, leaders, and ordinary citizens to stand firm in the face of adversity and to never leave a comrade behind. Memorials to the Lost Battalion and the 442nd can be found in both France and the United States. In the forests of the Vosges, plaques and monuments mark the places where the siege unfolded, where men fought, suffered, and triumphed together. In America, the legacy of the 442nd is honored in museums, veterans' halls, and annual ceremonies. Their story is part of the fabric of the nation's history, a chapter that speaks to the enduring values of loyalty, sacrifice, and the belief that freedom is worth fighting for. For the families of those who served, the legacy is deeply personal. Letters, medals, and photographs are treasured reminders of loved ones who faced the unimaginable and emerged with their honor intact. Children and grandchildren grow up hearing the stories, learning not just about war but about the strength of the human spirit. The lessons of the Lost Battalion are passed down, not as tales of glory, but as reminders of what it means to care for one another, to persevere, and to hope. As time moves on and the number of living survivors dwindles, the responsibility to remember and to share their story grows ever more important. The world has changed, but the challenges of division, conflict, and hardship remain. The example set by the Lost Battalion and the 442nd is as relevant today as it was in 1944. It reminds us that unity, courage, and compassion can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. In the end, the Lost Battalion was never truly lost. Their courage, their sacrifice, and their brotherhood live on, in the pages of history, in the hearts of their families, and in the spirit of all who refuse to give up. Their story is a beacon, shining through the darkness, reminding us that even in the most desperate circumstances, hope can endure and triumph. If you have been moved by this story, remember the men who fought and the lessons they left behind. Share their legacy, honor their memory, and let their courage inspire you to face your own challenges with the same determination and heart. The Lost Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team showed the world what is possible when people stand together. Their story is not just history, it is a call to action for us all.